Toshiba is a Japanese company that I've always known for their consumer electronics. I'm talking about televisions, DVD players, computers, but in reality, they are a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that over the years has been responsible for technological advances in all of these different fields. They officially formed in 1939 when two separate makers of electrical equipment decided to merge together. Both of those companies, by the way, have roots going back to the 1800s. One of them was the first in Japan to make incandescent lamps, having invented the double coil electric bulb, while the other one made Japan's first X-ray tubes and hydroelectric generators. Once combined, they continued to innovate, taking advantage of Japan's good economic condition in the 1950s by selling newly developed broadcast equipment and microwave ovens. By the 1980s, they were not only a major provider of consumer electronics, they were also heavily involved in memory chips, semiconductors, and even medical equipment. Honestly, it's all overwhelming. Toshiba has spread into so many different directions that it's almost impractical to follow each step of their evolution. So instead, I think I'd prefer to jump around to some of Toshiba's most major setbacks. They have been developing a negative reputation and have not been looking great financially. Their net income has been all over the place for decades now, and in terms of sales, they have been shrinking overall. I think it's interesting how such a seemingly classic yet forward-thinking company could repeatedly find itself in so much trouble. So I've compiled a list of 5 major struggles. It's a combination of scandals, poor decisions, and outside factors that have all impacted them significantly. Going chronologically, first off is what I'm going to call the submarine scandal. In 1987, they owned 51% of a subsidiary called Toshiba Machine that was involved in making submarines. Well, that subsidiary illegally sold multiple milling machines used for making submarine propellers to the Soviet Union, and I'm afraid that summary doesn't make it sound quite as severe as it actually was. There was something in place called the COCOM agreement, basically an international embargo on trading with communist countries like the Soviet Union at the time. With this sale, Toshiba broke the agreement and provided the enemy with advanced technology for making submarines. The US government claimed that it would cost billions of dollars for them and other countries to develop technology to detect these new, quieter Russian submarines. There were campaigns going around in the US calling for a boycott of Toshiba products, which was a big concern for them because about 10% of their annual sales were coming from the US. So it was made out to be a big deal, and it does look like Toshiba felt horrible about it. They claim that they had no idea what the subsidiary was doing, but even so, they paid about $1 million to take out all of these full-page ads in newspapers across the United States apologizing for what happened. Additionally, the president and the chairman of Toshiba, two different people, both resigned, which evidently in the Japanese business world is the highest form of apology. Even still, in a 92-5 vote, the US Senate voted to ban the import of Toshiba products for about 3 years. There was even this popular picture taken of members of Congress destroying a Toshiba radio. It led many to believe that the effects of this would carry over to other Japanese companies and harm trade relations between the countries, which was huge because the US accounted for over a third of Japan's exports. Now, many people believe that this was a massive overreaction by the US government and even somewhat racist, citing examples of other countries that have broken the agreement with much lower consequences. I think the accusation was that those congressmen were upset with how much America was importing from Japan, and this was kind of their excuse to get everyone behind their cause. It goes pretty deep, but for today, I just wanted to convey that part of Toshiba did something illegal and it sparked a major political issue between them and the United States. The next struggle that I want to talk about involves their laptops. Now, in the past, they have been a major producer of laptops. I'm sure that many of the people watching this have owned one of them at some point. In fact, they are commonly credited as being the first company to sell a mass-produced laptop PC. Imagine that. Way back in 1985, they introduced the T1100. They sold it to the European public, and 1 year later, were selling an updated version of it in Japan and the United States. They obviously entered the market earlier than their competitors, and that helped them become become a market leader throughout the 1990s. However, they didn't maintain it too far past that. In 1999, those laptop computers that they had sold turned into a liability for them when there was a class action lawsuit about a defective floppy disk drive that was used in 5 million of them in the United States, going all the way back to those initial ones sold in the 1980s. Toshiba didn't put up much of a fight either. They never admitted to doing anything wrong, but shockingly agreed to pay about $1 billion to settle that case. According to their president at the time, they settled because losing that case could have cost them almost 10 times as much and put the company into danger. A year later, they also settled a similar case with the US government for $23 million involving computers specifically sold to them. The cases impacted the reputation of the laptops, and for other reasons, they continued to lose market share to Dell and HP, and briefly even started losing money in that segment. By 2018, that part of their business had lost a ton of value, so they sold it to Sharp for only $36 million. That price was for only 80% of it, but they sold the remaining 20% soon after, meaning Toshiba no longer makes laptops, and it's questionable how much they ever really benefited from them. The next struggle is likely the least impactful, but I think it's interesting: HD DVDs. See, Toshiba had been heavily involved in DVDs since the beginning. In 1992, they spent $500 million to buy about a 5% stake in Time Warner. They were the owners of HBO and Warner Studios and a bunch of other stuff, but what's significant here is that they teamed up to create this disc technology that was used as part of the creation of the DVD. And in 1996, Toshiba was the first company to introduce a DVD player. Then, about a decade later, there was this new format war between Toshiba's HD DVD and Sony's Blu-ray. I made a whole video talking about it if you want to hear the details, but to spoil the ending, Toshiba lost. All of the major movie studios, including Warner, eventually chose to release their stuff on Blu-ray, and Toshiba gave up on their format, meaning all the money that they spent promoting it, trying to get the HD DVD to catch on, was essentially wasted, and in the end, it was a failed effort that hurt Toshiba. Next up is their involvement in nuclear power. They had been involved in it in different capacities going back decades, notably teaming up with GE and Hitachi to form Global Nuclear Fuel in the year 2000. But what took their involvement to a much greater level and ultimately became an issue for them was their 2006 acquisition of the nuclear power company Westinghouse Electric. They paid $5.4 billion for 77% of it, later acquired the rest of it, and probably wish that they hadn't. In 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster made everyone much more apprehensive about nuclear power and likely harmed the industry. Toshiba wasn't directly involved in that, but being just a few years after the acquisition, it was unfortunate timing. In 2016, they reported a $2.3 billion impairment charge related to Westinghouse Electric, saying that that segment had lost value. They claimed that it was due to an accounting scandal from the year before. It caused their credit rating to go down, so no one would lend them the money that they needed for their projects. Some of those projects, by the way, being these power plants that they were trying to build in Georgia and South Carolina. It appears that they underestimated the time and the money that they would take. They were in a position where they couldn't afford to complete them, but then they also couldn't afford to give up on them because there would be penalties. In early 2017, everything started falling apart. In February, they postponed their earnings report and announced that their chairman would be stepping down. A month later, Westinghouse Electric filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and about a year after that, Toshiba sold the company for $4.6 billion. It was less than they paid for it, not even accounting for the decade of time and money that they had invested in it. All of the money that they had lost from it and the instability that it caused within the company were likely the motivation for Toshiba to sell off other parts of their business. Most notably, in 2017, they sold their famous memory chip segment for $18 billion, though they did quickly take $3 billion of that and reinvest it into the company that they sold it to. Alright, the final struggle that I want to talk about is their accounting fraud. It's kind of where this whole video has been leading. Everything on my list has been harmful toward their profits, not to mention the external economic factors that I didn't even put on the list because they weren't unique to Toshiba. In 1997, they felt some effects from the Asian financial crisis. In 2001, they felt the effects of the dot-com bubble bursting, and in 2008, they were hurting from the global financial crisis. They were facing a lot of challenges, so by 2009, they were losing money. But as we all know, you don't want to tell investors that you're losing money. It motivates them to sell their shares, the stock price goes down, and the company becomes less valuable, so everything goes bad. Their solution to all of that was not the best idea. It was to lie to everybody. It's easy enough, right? You don't actually have to make a bunch of money. All you have to do is tell people that you made a bunch of money. For example, in 2009, they lost almost 400 billion yen, but they reported that they only lost 20 billion. The following year, when they lost 54 billion, they reported that they actually made 138 billion. I'm sorry, but I always think that accounting frauds like this are actually so much worse than they sound on the surface. Just think that the general public, people sacrificing to invest their money, looking to make smart financial decisions, and doing their homework by analyzing the figures, were completely lied to about those figures. It's not as easy as just erasing a number and replacing it. It does take some skillful accounting tricks, but in the end, the reports are fake either way. Some of the ways they did it, if they were going to make money in the future, they would instead report it ahead of time. On the other end, if they were going to lose money in the future, they would hold off and report it later. When they bought raw materials, they would say that they spent less money on them than they actually did. For long-term construction contracts, they would intentionally estimate their costs to be too low and then mess around with the period in which they were reporting them. The point is that this was a carefully orchestrated plan that was skillfully executed to deceive investors. The leaders of the company would set these challenges, basically target profits, and make it clear to the people below them that failure was not an option. So if one of the units couldn't reach the goal, they would be motivated to mess around with the numbers and report that they did reach it. And everyone else is just looking the other way and letting it happen. Sometimes those challenges were impossible to reach, so of course any ethical person should be questioning why they were reached. In 2015, it was all exposed and found to have been taking place for the past 7 years, totaling in misstatements of more than 150 billion yen, which is well over $1 billion. It happened over the leadership of 3 different CEOs, all of which still worked for the company at the time and resigned almost right away. During that current CEO's resignation, he called the scandal the most damaging event for our brand in the company's 140-year history, which I have to say is a big statement considering everything else that we've talked about in this very video. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on Toshiba? Do you feel any differently about them after having watched this video? Again, I do want to point out that it's not all bad with them. They have innovated or produced some of the world's biggest products for decades now, but they have had their share of struggles and have been pretty scandalous. Looking back at the list, 2 of them are definite scandals, 2 of them are more poor business decisions, maybe even out of their hands to a degree, while the laptop thing is potentially a combination of both. So any thoughts you have about Toshiba or any of their struggles or innovations, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.